stop sharing. There we go. So today, I'm really excited to introduce Finley Green, who how long ago was it when we spoke? It was quite a few months now, wasn't it?
No,
Like September,
November,
October?
October,
Yeah, yeah,
November.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And Finley has a really interesting talk lined up, and I always like these talks from people who do presentations who don't work in academia, because I think they present a different way of doing things and present, I think, different challenges and different ways of working. And we spoke very briefly before. I said, I bet you don't have as long in your research cycle as we do in academia, because research in academia can take a very long time. So I'm very, very looking forward to cracking the complexity code, although I think Finley has certain issues with me over the snappy title. So I'm just going to get through. So I'm just going to introduce Finley. So Finley has over 8 years experience leading theory-driven evaluations of complex interventions. And he first came to realist evaluation as a practitioner, as opposed to as a student, as many of us have done. His approach has been shaped by trial and error. I think we can all relate to that. I think I made more errors than I did non-errors. And he has read and learned from the real world challenges of evaluation. So Finley specialises in combining methods like theory of change, contribution analysis, and realist evaluation to address practical questions, not just whether something works, but for whom, under what circumstances, and why. That's the mantra that we're all very familiar with. His career includes leadership roles at Dartington Service Lab, where he designed and delivered evaluations of place-based system change and youth development programs. And now, as a senior evaluation advisor with the Open Innovation team, he is helping to establish a new government evaluation service, embedding complexity-sensitive evaluation approaches, shaping strategy, and generating actionable insights for policymakers. Actually sounds pretty awesome, if you ask me. Do you enjoy working at Dartington? I mean, you have to say yes, really, don't you? I
I
mean,
know,
I
I
put
do,
you on the
don't I?
spot.
No, I loved it there. They always gave lots of responsibility to young researchers, so I always really appreciate it. If you had a good idea or you wanted to do something rogue, like suddenly start doing realist evaluation when nobody in the organisation had done it before, they'll let you have a crack. So definitely, it's been a brilliant place to learn.
So that, I mean, that's interesting for those of you that may be thinking about a job outside of academia, either after PhD or even after postdoc, that there are places out there where you can still do research. So it might be worth following people like Dartington Service Lab and Finley on places like LinkedIn, just to get more of an idea. So Finley, do you want to just dive straight in? I might do a few, if you want to upload your presentation, and whilst you're doing that, I'll just do a few housekeeping rules. So during the talk, if we can keep microphones off, if any presents anything at any slide and you want to ask a question, start putting your questions in the slide as the talk is moving on, and then at the end I'll filter the questions, and if you want, you can ask them. If you don't have a private space or your mic isn't working, I can ask the question for you, and then Finley will answer. So we'll have a lot of time for Q&A at the end of this. I also will post links from the relevant slides as they come up in the chat, so that if you want to follow anything on, then you can do. And Sonia's just put hello from the northeast of England. Hello, Sonia. I'll be up there soon visiting my folks. 1 degree. That is actually cooler than it was when I was up there a couple of weeks ago for your symposium. I actually thought of you, Finley, when I was at the symposium that Sonia had. It would have been interesting to have insights, I think, from evaluators like yourself at the symposium that we had up in Northumbria. So I don't know how you get involved with academic conferences, but it would have been an interesting, I think, melding of communities to be able to bring that commercial and academic space together. But Sonia might think completely differently though, so she might just be rolling her eyes at me right now, but never mind.
I've actually met Sonia before. Sonia might not remember, but I did Justin Jagosh's one of his CARES training sessions, and Sonia was my 15-minute tutor for the problem I was bringing, which I think I might touch on here. But yeah, it was very, very useful, an important milestone in me figuring out what the hell I was doing. So thanks for that, Sonia.
There you go. There you go. Another vote for Sonia. Right. Okay. So, like I said, put your questions in the chat as they're coming. I will deal with them, and I think that's it, really, Finley. So, I'll put my camera off. So so you don't get so distracted by people moving around, because people do tend to sort of fly around. And we'll ask people to turn the cameras off and then come back on at the end when you finish. But thank you very much, and over to you.
Sure. Okay. Well, hello everyone. So I'm really excited for today and very grateful to Joe for giving me the slot. Um, I'm going to be talking about how and why I think realist valuation and contribution analysis can work together in evaluations of complex interventions. I don't know if I'm going to crack the complexity code. That seems like a bold ask, but Joe told me to come up with a snappy title, so here we are. Um, so yeah, it's really rare in the consultancy world, I was talking to Joe about this before, to get this much time and space to really get into the weeds of the methods. I've never really had the chance to do this before. Yeah, which is why I can't wait to get started. So as Joe's alluded to, when I developed the methods and led the evaluation I'm going to use as a case study, I was working at Dartington, and Joe's already described a bit about it. But it's essentially a research and design charity, really focused on improving outcomes for children and young people. They basically help services and systems get better by combining the best available evidence with the insights of users and practitioners. And about me, yeah, as Joe's mentioned, I was an evaluation lead at Dartington until a few weeks ago. There for over 8 years, doing lots of evaluations of complex programs, and that's covered everything from smoking cessation to domestic violence, mental health, youth violence, from babies through to teenagers, and from small interventions led by charities right the way through to large-scale national public health programs. But as Joe said, since the start of the year, I've been on secondment, which has been a big change for me after 8 years at Dartington, as a senior evaluation advisor for the Open Innovation Unit's new evaluation service. And we need a better way of saying that. But yeah, it's an in-house cross-government consultancy aimed at improving evaluation capacity and impact across UK government departments. So the agenda, in terms of how we're going to go through this. So again, as Joe mentioned, I came to realist evaluation and contribution analysis through evaluation practice. So they were solutions to evaluation problems I encountered in my day job as an evaluator, trying to offer useful, usable advice to decision makers. So I'm going to start off by describing my encounter with the harsh glare of reality after my master's, how realist evaluation completely changed my perspective, and then how contribution analysis entered the frame. And then I'll then talk about how it all came together in an evaluation I led of a complex place-based early years program. It's called Lambeth Early Action Partnership, or LEAP, before offering some reflections and opening it up to the Q&A at the end. So I joined Dartington a year after finishing my master's, full of enthusiasm and ready to apply my freshly minted social research skills to the real world. Real people, real projects, real impact. That picture with that dusty haircut, that is actually from my undergrad dissertation, when I went knocking on every third door in an area of Sheffield where I studied, asking about community relations with my extremely half-baked survey and topic guide. And that was where I realized I really wanted to do social research. If I could get paid to do this stuff, having so many interesting conversations, then that was for me. And I carried that enthusiasm through to my master's and to Dartington. And I was really excited because Dartington wasn't your average evaluation consultancy. So they did have and continue to have a really strong reputation. In the 90s and early noughties, they were basically trailblazers in expanding the use of randomized controlled trials, RCTs, in the UK. But they'd started to feel over time before I joined that while RCTs are valuable, they don't always satisfy the needs of delivery organizations and people who are making decisions in a timely way for reasons that will be familiar to realist evaluators. So I'm not going to open that Pandora's box. But so yeah, pretty much as I joined, Dartington pivoted. They renewed their commitment to evaluations that were useful and usable, and they prioritized the needs of the organizations they evaluated, feeding back findings regularly to improve services. And that sounded like exactly my kind of thing. But then, reality hit, basically. So while the ambition was there, the toolkit wasn't quite keeping up. So we were still relying on logic models from Dartington's RCT days for deciding what data to collect and analyze. And logic models, for those of you who don't know, are essentially flowcharts that articulate the inputs, outputs, and outcomes of a program in a kind of results chain. And when we shared findings back, it just didn't resonate. Practitioners didn't see their priorities reflected. Plus, we would often share back data in workshops on things like attendance in practitioner sessions with service users. And when we did, we'd report on averages with some summary statistics, standard stuff. But that meant it always fell flat because they couldn't see themselves in it. It was the kind of the ultimate one size fits none approach. And then in the midst of all this existential wrestling with our evaluation approach, life threw a bit of a curveball. So I tore my ACL in a game of five-a-side football, gutted, and ended up needing surgery, which meant taking a month of work to recover. And this was back in 2019, I think, yeah. So with time on my hands and a colleague's recommendation ringing in my ears, I decided to give Realistic, as it was, Realistic Evaluation a go. Now, I'll be honest, doesn't scream page turner, does it? I mean, what a book, but that has to be one of the worst covers of all time. I mean, what is the shading doing? Where is the foreground? Where is the background? I'm not sure, but I got stuck in, and it articulated everything I've been struggling with in ways I hadn't managed to pinpoint myself. So first of all, it explained why practitioners weren't happy with average effects, which might seem obvious to the average person, but to researchers, we sometimes get lost with this stuff. Because of course, programs don't work in the same way for everyone, as we all know. Different people, different settings, different practitioners, it all varies. Or as Ray Pawson so memorably puts it, what works in Wigan on a wet Wednesday won't work in Thurso on a thunderous Thursday. And the second thing it did was showed why logic models weren't hitting the mark. They just didn't capture the messy human elements that really explained how and why things worked, like the personalized therapeutic relationships practitioners built with their service users. They didn't fit neatly into our tidy boxes and arrows diagrams, and these will be things that we'll all recognize as mechanisms. It's not just practitioners who care about these things, decision makers do too. So understanding why something worked in Wigan is the only way to figure out if it's likely to work in Thurso. And this quote I often use actually for people that are new to realist valuation. It's from Lee Crombach in Brad Asprey's chapter in Doing Realist Research, which stuck with me as a football fan. That was my context. But knowing this week's score doesn't tell the coach how to prepare for next week's game. And he goes on to explain that simply knowing if an intervention had good or bad outcomes doesn't help decision makers. They need to know why it worked or didn't, under what conditions, so they can replicate or adapt it in new settings. So from that point onwards, this idea of providing context-specific, explanation-driven advice really became my kind of North Star. So I threw myself headfirst into all things realist valuation, so much so that someone I line managed genuinely thought the book was called Realist Evaluation Changed My Life, because that's how I always introduced it to her. And that is not, that's actually true. That's quite sad, isn't it? So anyway, realist valuation. But realist valuation is all about learning more and more about less and less, as Porter says. So the goal is to dig deep into how programs work by unpacking context, mechanism, outcome configurations, or CMOCs. And the process starts with broader, more general hypotheses, and then refines them into more detailed, nuanced explanations. And as Ray Pawson and Anna Manzano put it, the hypotheses multiply until the researcher reaches exhaustion or runs out of funding. But there's a catch, right? So if we focus too much on granular causal relationships, we risk losing sight of the intervention as a whole. And often the people being evaluated, whether they're frontline practitioners or funders, want a more comprehensive answer. So it's not how did a handful of contextual factors trigger these specific mechanisms, but rather how did our program work overall, for whom, under what circumstances, and why. And it's important evaluation focuses on answering the most important, useful questions and not just the ones that we can give the most confident answer to. And this is particularly challenging and kind of drilling down into CMOCs, particularly problematic when you're dealing with big complex programs. That's what I found, comprising multiple interventions aimed at large and varied populations. How then can we answer the questions people want answered about the contribution of whole programs? And then, it's important not to forget the importance of transparency. So realist evaluation is notoriously opaque. If you go into a room of practitioners, policymakers, other evaluators from different fields, basically anyone who's not a realist evaluator, and start banging on about context, mechanism, outcome configurations, you will be met with a sea of blank faces, as I'm sure many of us have done and have been. And with complex programs, the issue only grows. So evaluating large dynamic systems change programs is tricky. Interactions are unpredictable, they're layered, and that makes decisions in evaluation more tentative, more uncertain. And that's why defining program theory, identifying the right people to validate it, and analysing data all require input from those with relevant expertise, which will include stakeholders within the system of interest. So if evaluators kind of monopolise the process with obscure methods, then we risk making mistakes and missing valuable knowledge and expertise. And that's when I stumbled on contribution analysis. So contribution analysis is a systematic, collaborative method for understanding how much an intervention, both as a whole and in its parts, influenced outcomes, while also considering rival influences and alternative explanations. And this is a really important, often overlooked element in realist evaluations. And it's something Paulson himself is emphasizing in his latest book, How to Think Like a Realist, when he talks about the importance of theory adjudication. So contribution analysis, it generally involves 6 steps, which move through outlining what you're trying to achieve and how your efforts are supposed to lead to that outcome before gathering evidence and identifying other factors that might be influencing the results. And then finally, you kind of refine your story with more evidence, addressing any gaps or weaknesses identified by those with relevant expertise. And for those of you who are interested, this special issue in the Evaluation Journal from 2012, I think, is probably the best place to start. So I found it really, really helpful. And what I really appreciate about contribution analysis is how it tackles complexity. So in large programs where the paths to impact are numerous, they're messy, it provides a structured way to gather and interpret evidence. So it defines the strength of evidence through triangulation, so checking whether different sources of data align, and brings in diverse perspectives to get a fuller picture. And it's a process that's not only systematic, but also transparent, right? Because it involves multiple stakeholders at every stage and the steps are quite clearly laid out. So evidence is collected on each part of the program theory, reviewed collaboratively, and refined where necessary through further data collection on any identified weaknesses. But again, like all methods, like realist valuation, contribution analysis isn't perfect. So just like realist valuation, it's a theory-driven approach. So it starts with a theory of change, which is essentially another boxes and arrows flowchart. It's not too different from a logic model, or some people describe logic models as what theories of change often look like. And as with logic models, theories of change can be criticized for oversimplifying things, right? For failing to fully capture the mechanisms at play and the contextual factors that influence outcomes. And in fact, I saw an email on the Ramsey's email thread from Jill Westhorpe saying just this, I think yesterday or the day before. And that's why I decided to combine realist evaluation with contribution analysis across 3 evaluations, because doing so allowed me to balance that kind of structured, transparent process of contribution analysis with the mechanism and contextual sensitivities of realist evaluation. So now I'm going to walk you through how I did it and what I learned using the biggest and kind of most complex of those evaluations, the evaluation of Lambeth Early Action Partnership, or LEAP. So, LEAP. Now, as we all know, child development unfolds within a unique context, right? It's different for every child. The people and places we grow up with and in constantly interact, shaping our development. So it's not just about our brains and bodies, it's how they adapt to a complex, ever-changing world. So Lambeth Early Action Partnership, LEAP, is set out to be a positive force for change in that context. So it was one of 5 local partnerships within A Better Start, which was a 10-year program funded by the National Lottery Community Fund from 2015 to 2025 in the UK. So with around £40 million in funding, LEAP aimed to improve the life chances of babies, young children and families in some of Lambeth's most deprived areas. Now this high level, very high level theory of change on the right, that basically articulates how LEAP tried to achieve that. So essentially aim to build the foundations, that's that first step, the foundations necessary to strengthen the physical and social environments around children, that's the second step, in order to improve their outcomes and reduce inequalities in early childhood development, and that's that step number 3. And it tried to strengthen environments in 3 ways. First, by introducing over 30 services. Second, by strengthening connections between services, community organizations and families. And third, by influencing the wider system. But LEAP didn't operate in a vacuum, right? Any impact it had was shaped by its interaction with existing things in these environments and services in the area. And our challenge was basically to unravel that complexity. So our job was to figure out how much LEAP contributed to better outcomes and, crucially, which children benefited under what conditions and why. So how did we navigate that kind of complexity and answer those questions? So first thing we did was build the theory of change I just briefly talked through, but we built it using adapted realist matrices as building blocks in a kind of modular approach to a theory of change. So this is basically the main thing I'm going to be speaking about today. So by giving us a way to combine the CMOC structure of realist evaluation with the theory of change structure of contribution analysis and that whole intervention perspective, realist matrices were the main way we kind of combined the two approaches, and they really were what made it work. So a realist matrix is essentially a table in which a collection of contextual factors, mechanisms, and outcomes that share patterns of influence are linked together under a higher order, more abstract CMOC. And we adapted and built on the realist matrix structure by using the modified CMO framework proposed by Sonia Dolkin and others, which breaks mechanisms down into four components, or breaks CMOCs down into four components, sorry. Mechanism resource, context, mechanism response, and outcome. And for simplicity in this study, and in the interest of transparency with the partner to make it easy to understand, we used a streamlined version. So we split it up into resource, context, mechanism, and outcome. And we did that because separating resources and responses, so that the two key features of mechanisms in realist methodology, alongside an explanation of the relationship between the two, helps evaluators to avoid conflating program activities with mechanisms, which is a really common challenge in realist evaluation. And the way we applied realist matrices was really important for helping us to keep the whole intervention in focus and for allowing us to hold theory lightly. So I'll explain exactly what that means. So first, how it helped us look at the whole intervention. Well, it helped us look at the whole thing left to right. And each of these blocks on the slide basically represents a realist matrix. So they each focus on different steps in the theory of change: building foundations, strengthening environments, and improving outcomes. And separating resources from responses allowed us to link these realist matrices in a causal chain, so where the outcome of one matrix became the resource for the next. And this was really important for keeping the whole intervention in focus, including these three main steps in the theory of change. Also, most theories of change only examine mechanisms, if they do examine them at all, at the point where program resources interact with participant responses. But we wanted to go further and explore how change happened across the entire process. So, implementation research really it often overlooks how implementation strategies actually drive implementation itself. But our approach allowed us to really pin those relationships down. They also, realist matrices, helped us to look at the whole intervention top to bottom. So they gave us the flexibility to develop kind of nested theories of change for LEAP's three core strands: services, connections, and the wider system. So these were nested in the sense that they sat with it. They were a lower tier of a lower tier section within the theory of change. And the outcomes from each of these three realist matrices, services, connections, and wider system, so 2A to B and 2C, then fed in to the next stage of the theory. So it really helped us then to articulate how they all contributed together to improving outcomes for children. And this touches on another point. So the way in which these realist matrices helped us to hold theory lightly in this evaluation. And to illustrate that, let's set aside Sonia's adapted CMO framework for a moment and focus on the original approach. So context, mechanism, outcome. So as realist evaluators, we all know keeping our CMO configurations intact is crucial. That was one of the main insights from Ray Paulson and Anna Manzano's 2012 Realist Diagnostic Workshop. So their strength lies in their explanatory power, right? They're showing how and why mechanisms lead to outcomes in specific contexts. And that ensures we stay focused on the relationships between these components during evaluations rather than treating them as isolated elements. Because when CMOs become unconfigured, broken down into separate lists of context, mechanisms, and outcomes, we risk losing sight of those crucial relationships. So instead of understanding how an intervention works, we end up just cataloging its parts, right? We're looking at its anatomy rather than its physiology. And that's why evaluations need to keep sight of the hypothesized relationships between these components and articulate and test clear relationships between C's, M's, and O's. But a balance is needed. So a few people have argued that the traditional CMO heuristic, with its reliance on long lists of neatly bound configurations, struggles to capture the complexity, the non-linearity, and the emergent nature of real-world interventions, particularly complex ones. And I ran into exactly that challenge in my first realist evaluation. Since I was looking at the whole intervention, I ended up with way too many CMOCs. This was the problem I actually went to Sonia with. I had about 86 or something, far more than we could realistically evaluate with our resources. And even if we had been able to do so, the sheer volume would have been overwhelming for anyone else involved, right? So no one would have had the time or patience to read through it, or let alone use it to make any meaningful decisions. And then to make things even more complicated, these elements weren't neatly separated. They were tangled together. So there were multiple contexts influenced multiple mechanisms and outcomes in overlapping ways. So the reality was layered, messy, and interconnected. It just didn't fit into a simple CMO structure. So the challenge was figuring out how to stay true to the method without losing sight of that bigger picture. And that's where the realist matrix came in. So instead of treating every C, M, and O as separate and isolated, either in linear CMOCs or unconfigured lists of Cs, Ms, and Os, we grouped them under broader, high-level categories that captured how they interacted with each other. So that helped us to strike the right balance. So we were able to hold the relationships between lower-level Cs, Ms, and Os a little more lightly, allowing overlapping and multiple interactions between them, while making sure things weren't unconfigured by articulating their causal relationships at a higher level through higher order, more abstract Cs, Ms, and Os. So to separate mechanism resources from mechanism responses and give us that left to right structure, that whole intervention focus, we then added in Sonia's adapted CMO model. And that gave us the realist matrix structure that we used in these studies. I should flag, this is a little bit of a departure from how they were originally envisaged, and see the original article for further detail. But I think we were holding things a little bit more lightly than was the case in the original. And I'm very aware we are long overdue for an example. So let's take a look at how this worked in practice with the findings related to one of the nested theories of change I mentioned earlier, the one around LEAP's connections workstream. So at a high level, our theory predicted that if LEAP developed a connecting infrastructure, so the resource in Sonia's adapted CMO framework, then families would have better access to support, to choice over that support and how they interacted with it, and to relationships with other parents and their practitioners and others in the community. And that part was the outcome. And why would that happen? Because the infrastructure would help practitioners develop holistic practice. That's the mechanism. And I'll come back to the context later on. So let me explain in a bit more detail, particularly around the relationship between the resource and the mechanism, to highlight how and why realist matrices were useful. So this connecting infrastructure was essentially this kind of hum of backbone support that LEAP set up, which actually comprised 4 interconnected work streams or interconnected resources. So one was about protecting child and family spaces by investing in building and improving them. So they poured a lot of money into doing up children's centres and other community spaces. They wanted to ensure families and communities actively participated in the design and delivery of support. So they set up regular and meaningful ways for that to happen. They wanted to put relationships at the centre by offering peer support opportunities to families, community workers, and practitioners. And they wanted to make sure they get the families the support they needed and wanted when they needed and wanted it, by coordinating that support and including really pinning down their referral pathways and putting a lot of money, time, and effort into developing the skills and knowledge of the early years workforce. Now, these 4 work streams interacted with and reinforced one another in myriad ways to support the development of holistic practice, which was holistic in the sense that it supported practitioners to take a kind of whole family perspective. Families present with a range of needs, hopes, interests, opportunities, and they can't all be catered to by one service or practitioner. Now, holistic practitioners understood this and built on the skills, knowledge, resources offered up by this connecting infrastructure to work closely and flexibly with community workers, other practitioners, and families to deliver family-centered care. And a great example of this in action from our findings is one which highlights how these resources overlapped to enable holistic practice. And it's all about LEAP's domestic abuse service, which basically aim to provide more holistic support for parents at risk of domestic abuse. And rather than focusing narrowly on safety, they looked at the whole person. So they addressed a whole range of needs to promote overall well-being for parents and children. But doing that well required connecting effectively with the rest of the ecosystem surrounding families. So one of the ways they did that was through LEAP's provider forums, which were basically these kind of quarterly get-togethers of different services in the LEAP network. And the provider forums helped the domestic abuse service to build relationships with other services and improve referrals. But they realized they still weren't reaching parents directly from the community. So through conversations with LEAP's parent volunteers, they discovered that their outreach materials were part of the problem. So they had terms like domestic violence on them, which felt intimidating and inaccessible to those who weren't ready to identify with that label. And a few simple changes in language made a huge difference in making the service more accessible. And flexibility was another key lesson. So in parent consultation sessions hosted by LEAP, parents told the domestic abuse service they needed more accessible ways to engage with them. So they started running women's advice surgeries in children's centres. And remember, LEAP had supported children's centres by putting money into developing the buildings and making them more welcoming and accessible for families and practitioners, and by making them more amenable to multi-agency working. So these parents might come into the surgeries with kind of financial concerns, and through those conversations, other issues like domestic abuse would come to light. So the approach allowed them to connect with families earlier and in a way that felt more approachable. And LEAP then helped to amplify all of these efforts by promoting these surgeries across its other services, helping to raise awareness. And the domestic abuse service also made sure families were connected to the right support when their needs went beyond what they could offer. So whether it was health visiting teams, midwifery, or literacy programs. And these were relationships they developed at the provider forums, as well as through LEAP making introductions directly and offering kind of who's who training on the services and supports in their network to improve awareness among kind of individual services. So that example is really emblematic of LEAP's approach and, to be honest, many other complex place-based programs. So they're characterized by a series of complementary, flexible approaches that kind of semi-autonomous practitioners adapt to meet their needs and those of their families. And this kind of causal soup doesn't fit linear CMO chains, right? It needs to be held more lightly. So a few other core features of realist valuation really reinforce the degree to which realist matrices helped us to hold theory lightly. So a big advantage of using realist valuation is that mechanisms are transportable. So they act as reusable conceptual platforms, as Paulson calls them. So they operate at a level of abstraction above the superficial form of activities, which means they can be applied in different contexts. So take LEAP. If someone somewhere else wanted to replicate its success, they wouldn't need to replicate the exact relationships between domestic violence services and other kind of auxiliary services, because those relationships were specific to Lambeth and what Lambeth needed. But what they could do is build a connecting infrastructure that supports holistic practice within their own unique set of services, organizations, and communities, helping create dynamic networks of support tailored to their local context. And in the same way, we also treated context flexibly. So following the advice of Joanne Greenhalgh and Anna Manzano, we defined context by what it does, not what it is. In other words, we defined it like a mechanism. So realist evaluators are, I think, increasingly recognizing that what counts as context or mechanism really just depends on your vantage point within the system. But, and yeah, this is quite important. So we had to be careful not to lock ourselves into rigid definitions of context too early. So when we started the evaluation, we were working with a pretty untested theory of change made up of pretty untested realist matrices. So I'd been brought in at quite short notice and I'd had to get things moving quickly before cracking on with data collection. So because of that, our understanding of context was a bit too tentative to use the usual kind of teacher-learner approach in realist interviews where the evaluators kind of present their theory and participants respond to it. So instead, we asked open-ended questions about context guided by frameworks on systems change, including one of my favorites. It's by the consultancy FSG. It's called the Waters of Systems Change. And these frameworks helped us explore key system components, things like policies, relationships, power dynamics, ways of thinking, as well as system dynamics, things like emergence, feedback, and unpredictability. And others have taken a similar approach, combining both direct teacher-learner type questions, which we did do some of, based on some earlier research we'd done with through our community researchers, who are an important part of our team. So we didn't go in completely blind, but we did also ask a lot of indirect open questions, as others have done as well. And doing that really allowed us to stay flexible and responsive to what we were learning. So that was theory development. What about data collection and analysis? Well, as with the theory development stuff, with my evaluation journey in general, to be honest, the spirit was very much about pulling together useful bits and pieces from the theory-based evaluation family to help put some meat on the bones of realist evaluation principles. And this was where contribution analysis really came into its own. So with data collection, the focus was on being theory-driven to make sure we collected and analysed data on the things we thought were most likely to add value to the overall evidential picture. So again, standard realist evaluation stuff. But each piece of data was like a small tile in a larger kind of mosaic of evidence, helping us understand whether the things we expected to see, as articulated in our theory of change, actually took place. And practically, that meant creating a data collection table in which we broke down the theory of change components and connections into individual elements, articulated them in greater depth to create kind of targets and comparisons to understand what good looks like and measure against that, as well as outline sources of data and participants. And that process was it was pretty much inspired by Funnel and Rogers and their landmark text on theory-based evaluation. I think it's purposeful program theory, so I highly recommend that as well. It's a very practical guide to theory-based evaluation. Also, to add, most program theory elements were supported by several data sources to support the triangulation of evidence. What about analysis? Well, we opted for framework analysis, which again, I think is a common tool among realist evaluators. So framework analysis is a deductive method for analyzing qualitative data. In other words, it was suitable for researchers like us who already had a sense prior to analysis of how we would interpret and draw meaning from the data we collected based on the theory of change. So the core feature of framework analysis is a table that supports the analysis called a framework matrix. And in that table, the columns represent the individual elements within the theory of change, while the rows represent one type of data for one participant. So for example, one interview with a practitioner. Every transcript is then coded against that framework, with each cell representing relevant evidence from one type of data for one participant in relation to one piece of program theory. And this idea around kind of exactly what to put in each cell was drawn from a couple of contribution analysis evaluators. It's a really helpful paper. I won't be able to pronounce their names. It's Delahaye and Toulemont, I think. It's in that evaluation special issue on contribution analysis I mentioned at the start. So findings from quantitative data analysis were also added as a row with the corresponding insights categorized against different elements of our theory. And that really helped us to synthesize evidence in an integrated way rather than analyzing quant and qual separately, as some mixed methods evaluations inadvertently end up doing. And what about synthesis? Well, remember, with contribution analysis, synthesis happens through triangulation. So to synthesize the quantitative and qualitative data analysis captured in the framework matrix, we developed a triangulation assessment, which basically established the degree of convergence in our data at 3 levels. So between individuals within a stakeholder group, like between service users, for example, between stakeholder groups, so between service users and practitioners, and then between methods, so convergence between interview data and survey data, for example. And the level of convergence at each level was described kind of consistently using 4 categories. So one was full convergence, another was partial convergence, then silence and divergence. So the triangulation assessment really helped us to transparently and clearly for the partner read down the columns to determine the strength of evidence underpinning each element of the theory of change, the relative contribution made by each element to proximal links in the causal chain, and the way in which these elements and the mechanisms they triggered were contingent on context. And that whole assessment was developed by Frankensteining the methods of a couple of others, and I'm pretty sure Lauren's sharing those references as well. So we shared this with LEAP and invited them to interrogate the kind of evidential picture in line with recommended practice in contribution analysis, before having a few follow-up conversations to fill in the gaps. So where did we end up? Well, I'm not going to go through all the findings. They're online if you're interested. I can share a link. But instead, I just wanted to highlight a few and reflect on them to help bring things full circle from where we started at the start of this talk. So the whole point of this evaluation, and of evaluation generally, I think, was to provide useful, usable advice. So how did we do? Did LEAP find it useful? Did the rest of the kind of earliest community find it useful? So first reflection is that mechanisms really resonated with them. So we managed to condense the findings into 10 points. So 3 covered impact, where the LEAP made a difference. Spoiler, there were some positive signs, but it's a complex picture. 4 points focused on how it made a difference, including the connecting infrastructure and holistic practice we've already discussed. And the final 3 explored how LEAP was shaped by the wider context. So when I first shared this with the LEAP team, you could really, it was palpable. You could see the apprehension, right? So 10 years of their work was being summarized in 10 points on 2 sides of A4. And for some of them, this was literally their life's work. So especially the program director, Laura McFarlane, brilliant person, fantastic professional. And she was retiring at the end of LEAP, right? This was a big deal for her. But through collaboration, we landed on something everyone could agree on, thanks to the flexibility of the mechanisms like holistic practice, which resonated because they were abstract enough to allow for superficial variation in how, where, and with whom they were applied, which meant they didn't feel too constraining for the likes of Laura. So the second point is that this left to right structure that we used by connecting realist matrices in a line sort of back to front was massively helpful and helped us to answer important questions. Because, you know, while holistic practice made sense to those involved, to many outside of LEAP, the reaction was kind of tell us something we don't know, right? So frontline practitioners already understood the complexity of families' needs and their inability to address them alone. What they lacked was a system that enabled them to do holistic practice effectively. So by articulating mechanisms left to right across the theory of change, rather than just at the interface between program resources and participant responses, we were able to gather evidence on what that system looked like. Because what our evaluation showed is that LEAP's connecting infrastructure was what made holistic practice possible. And going even further back in the kind of causal chain, it was LEAP's principles-led strategy that enabled the infrastructure to emerge and grow. And how did it do that? Well, LEAP's high-level goal was really ambitious, right? It was improving outcomes and reducing inequalities in some of the most deprived parts of Lambeth. So that wasn't something they could do on their own, right? It wasn't something that a fixed set of activities could achieve. The problem was too complex, it was too deep-rooted. So instead of a rigid plan, LEAP adopted this principles-led strategy, which meant they worked in partnership, right? Sharing decision-making and capitalizing on expertise in different parts of the system. And that flexibility allowed them to adapt to new challenges and opportunities over time because, you know, the connecting infrastructure didn't just appear overnight. It took 5 years to fully establish itself, evolving through a test and learn approach supported by strong, long-standing relationships between health and local government partners that were really embedded within Lambeth and had been for decades. And it was this test and learn approach that was the mechanism in the first foundational realist matrix in our theory of change, right? The one that focused on building the foundations. So that left to right aspect was key in helping us to offer useful advice. But while mechanisms were critical, it was context that really brought the evaluation to life. So we took a dynamic approach to context, defining it by what it does, not just what it is, in line with Joanne Greenhouse and Anna Manzano's paper. And that helped us to paint a picture that really brought it to life. It really told the story of how context shaped LEAP's theory of change over time. And given we're talking about 10 years here, factoring in time to context was vital. You know, it was an absolutely necessary, absolutely fundamental. And the best example of this comes from the way we applied the concept of landscape shifts from the systems thinking field to help us. So between 2015 and 2024, rising demand and shrinking resources created a negative feedback loop for services. So large caseloads were leading to staff shortages in local government and health, especially in health visiting and midwifery. So their numbers have dropped by half during this period. And this in turn increased workloads even further. So this shifting landscape had a destabilizing effect that disrupted holistic practice and limited its reach. But disruption also created opportunities. So particularly after COVID, relationships between children's centres and community organisations strengthened as they looked for new ways to connect with families and fill gaps left by stretched services. And here's the last key takeaway. So this evolving contextual picture wasn't something we could have fully anticipated at the start, given the time and resources available. So by leaving space for context to emerge in a bit more of an open way, we captured a much richer and more dynamic understanding than we ever could have planned for. And that's it. So I hope you enjoyed it, and I'm really looking forward to the Q&A.
Wow, that was awesome. I could sit all afternoon in a coffee shop and just talk to you. That sounds like a fantastic piece of work. So, in true realist style, and don't give me a whole myriad of this fancy online clapping that I can't get to work. Turn on your cameras and let's have proper old-fashioned clapping because I'm getting a bit old. I've got a big birthday this year, so honor my big birthday and let's give Finley a proper thank you very much, like we would if he was in a seminar. Thank you. So thanks for like 3 people that joined in there. You were much better during COVID in joining in with the clapping. Maybe that's because we were clapping a lot in COVID, to be fair. So if anyone has any questions for Finley, can you put your questions in the chat, please? And I will come to you one by one. We filter the questions. So don't put your hands up, just put your questions in the chat. So Finley, I mean, like, just if I was just to ask you, like, overarching viewpoint, what was it like being part of that evaluation?
Well, I loved it. I mean, I'm from Lambeth, so that's the thing. So some of the services they were evaluating, I actually did. I took part in 30 years ago. So, oh yeah, it was amazing. I went to some of the children's centres. I did whippersnappers. I did some of this, which was, yeah, a kids service in my local area. So, no, it was amazing. And I think a better start is a really important part of been a really important part of the early years world over the last 10 years. So it was a privilege to be able to drop in at the end and try and make sense of it all. But no, it was brilliant. And yeah, quite humbling seeing how hard they were working. I mean, creating a connecting infrastructure will
Yeah.
make you go grey. And yeah, so that stuck with me as well.
I mean, it's an awesome piece of work. I mean, we were dipping out. We had a few technical challenges behind the scenes, which we usually sometimes have, sometimes we don't. But one of the things, one of the very early things that you mentioned in one of the first slides, which I felt resonated really well with me, and I actually thought of Sonia at the time when you did it, was around creating the importance of data that's relatable for the end user. And it was like one of those things I was thinking, crikey, yeah, that is. I mean, for me, the phrase I always use is like eyes on the prize. What is it you want to do with this evaluation at the end? But how did you ascertain what relatable data would, how did you know? Because you
Sure.
need to have some idea about what your end product, how did you work that out in the first place? And,
So
it did make me think of like the more experienced evaluators that we have in the room, like Sonia.
yeah, well, it was definitely trial and error. So we've talked about this a little bit before, didn't we? About the differences between being in a consultancy and maybe being in academia. Now, I don't know about
Yeah.
academia, but in a consultancy, your incentives are often the people who are directly in front of you, right? So they are the ones who we are trying to influence, which is the delivery organization. So, and I think the number of times or the intensity with which you're feeding stuff back is often quite high as well, right? To make it useful and usable. So it's just through 8 years of trying to give people something they can use, and struggling with that many times, but then over time getting better at that. I mean, also I always move in and out of getting into visualization. So, people remember pictures more so than they remember words. So I've tried to develop my ability with, very rudimentary graphic design stuff just to make sure I can communicate things. And where I can't do it, work with people who are much better at it to try and communicate this stuff. So that landscape shifts picture was developed by a design agency called Friendhood, who are amazing. I highly recommend them. They're very reasonably priced to work with, and they do fantastic work. And that kind of stuff sticks with people. So that's the other thing I'd say as well.
Yeah, I agree with. I'm rubbish with graphics and that sort of like visual interface. I do see occasionally when we go to conferences, you do see some amazing posters. I'm having a long COVID brain fog day, and I can't remember her name, but the person who wrote the swamp, the realist methods on
Yeah.
the swamp, and I met her last week, 2 weeks ago at Sonia's event. And I talked to her for ages, and I can't remember her name, but she's a very visual person, and I find her graphics and her posters really engaging as well.
So it's funny you say that, because I just finished How to Think Like a Realist, and the swamp metaphor was something that stuck with me. But it was meant when it was mentioned, so it's interesting. Yeah, it's a very good one.
So I'm just going to go through. So Naomi Clemens has got a question. Do you want to come on and ask your question, Naomi?
Yeah, more than happy to. Hi, Finley. Nice to see you again.
I know, I mean,
Um, just kind of reflection and a bit of a question as well. So I've worked at all sides, academia, like local authority, and then now consultancy. And I just wondered, obviously from a consultancy perspective, I'm figuring out you get no time to do a lot of work. So kind of how long did you actually get in terms of lead-in time and getting involved in this? And how did you take the clients on that journey if it was quite quick? Because often there
sure.
can be some kind of resistance and challenges to not understanding what's going on. So I just wondered if you've got any tips
Yeah.
and tricks.
So it's a good question. So it was March of last year. I was happily minding my own business, working on my projects. And then someone in my organization, because of some move around of staff, they were like, this needs you to come in, needs to work on this project. It's massively over budget, and we need to be ready to go with a data collection plan in we had from we had to be ready to go in sort of August.
Mm.
So and basically there'd been a formative evaluation, but it had a very different kind of focus. So all the hard yards of developing a theory of change, and moving that into a data collection table, moving that into a framework matrix, all that stuff had to happen during that period, um,
Mm.
which was very tight. But because I developed the methods over time, and because they were complexity sensitive, I felt like I had something ready to go. So I'd been practicing with combining realist valuation and contribution analysis on two other evaluations. So you'll know them because we talked about them. But yeah, the Becoming a Man program, which was a positive youth development program, a group-based intervention funded by the Youth Endowment Fund, and a program called Career Ahead, which was a kind of a similar program, but for education, employment, and training outcomes funded by the Youth Futures Foundation. So I'd done formative evaluations of those two where I had really experimented with this stuff to try and get it in a good place. So I think I was ready to go with the methods pretty much. Um, in terms of the relationship, it helped I was from the area. That definitely helped. Um, I think with delivery organizations and delivery partners, I think as evaluators, sometimes we forget how difficult it must be to have something that's so personal to you and then
Mm.
hand over the assessment of it to someone you have no and you don't know them at all, right? And how I've
Mm.
actually never had to do that in my job. Do you know what I mean?
Mm.
No one evaluates us, but so I think I sympathize with that. I get that until they trust you, they're going to ask for more. There's going to be more scrutiny. There's going to be more questions, but you use transparent methods like contribution analysis, you invite trust. And when you show you're not trying to hide anything, right? When you
Mm.
come back with findings and they're queried as they should be, you can say, well, this is where it's from. Here's our framework matrix. This is how the
Mm.
data is or isn't converging. That's how we've come to our conclusion, rather than feeling exposed because it was like a hunch or a general assessment of a theme. So I think having
Mm.
transparency right the way through really made a difference.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. It's really useful reflection. I'm working with a charity at the moment on an evaluation, and some of those things have come up for me, because we show up and go, oh yeah, we're just here to look at the data, and you forget that people think that you're there looking at them or looking at their life's work, and actually you're really interested in evidence and data. You're not really bringing your thoughts and feelings into it, but you forget that. So yeah, that's really useful. Thanks, Finley.
Thanks, Naomi. That was a good question. Thank you. There were so many things that I could just probably spend all day talking to you about it, Finley. So I'll move on to Faye. If you are here still, I don't think you've got your camera on. If you have, you must be on another screen. I've got three screens of
Yep.
people at the moment. Are you there,
Hi,
Faye?
I am here.
Yeah,
Yeah, hi.
nice
Hi.
to
I'm
see you
scrolling
again.
back to kind of hiya. Thank you so much, Finley. It was so interesting. And, coming from local authority context, myself working in local authority, but now doing PhD, I was really interested in, I think I put whether you uncovered any sort of theories about what worked or didn't work really, and how, whether you had any challenges in relaying that back. How did they land with the local authority?
Mm-hmm.
And um, yeah, just thinking about that
Yeah,
kind of KPI type mentality in local authorities and how
sure.
do you manage that tension?
So one thing to say is LEAP was close to the local authority, but it wasn't the local authority, so it was slightly separate and had slightly different pressures. I think one of the things that was lucky was that there were some positive signs when it came to their impact overall, right? So it's easy for evaluators when that's the case. So they used the ages and stages questionnaire the health visiting data set for the ages and stages of questionnaire at 2.5. They got access to that. They also got access to the early years foundation stage profile, just a reception age. The former showed some tentative positive signs from it was a cross-sectional analysis, kind of a multiple logistic regression, and the latter didn't show much. So overall positive signs, but some question marks over why they weren't seeing what they were seeing, and also huge question marks generally, because these things can only explain so much. There's a lot of uncertainty. And I think that was the other thing, was we were never coming down hard and fast on what was happening. We always had to exercise a good amount of humility, because everyone knew that LEAP was huge, messy, difficult to pin down. So everything we were describing was tentative signs based on what we'd accumulated over time. I'd say for the qualitative data, we were really helped by how much we collected. So we did spoke to, I don't know, 130 people. Most of those was a whole range of people, including 50 parents, lots of parents from communities that were hardly being reached by mainstream services. So that again gave us some credentials we could stand on. So I think they've been going for 10 years as well, right? So I think they'd already come full circle when it came to just looking at what works. They knew that was limited in terms of their context. So we didn't really have much of a case to make there as well, I'd say, if that was your question. Yeah.
Yeah. No, thank you. That's really helpful.
Thanks. Faye, I've had a deja vu moment. Have we met?
We have met.
NIHR conference two and a bit years ago. Yeah,
I think we did. Yes, that's exactly
so
right.
You are a teacher or something like that?
I'm a virtual school head teacher, but no one knows what that is, so I just tend to keep it to myself.
There you go. And I was like, I've met her. You know that moment, so sorry. But what I can say is thank you. Nice to meet you again. Nice to see you.
Thank you.
Moving on to Sonia, who I've definitely met. So I know I've definitely met Sonia, so I don't have to ask that question. I was really interested in the things that you had to say as well, especially when you presented the components, the frameworks that you used for the contribution analysis. So that was the bit I was trying to look at my research and work out, could I do this? Could we do this with a review? That might be a good question for Andrew. But Sonia, do you want to come on and ask yours as well?
Yeah, just to say thanks, Finley. I really enjoyed that. It was really clear. I think for me, my question comes from some struggles that we're currently toying with within the REAM project, as I've mentioned in my post there on the chat, around kind of what is the benefit of these types of methods. So looking at kind of QCA or contribution analysis in providing a more integrated and triangulated findings instead of kind of just good mixed methods. And I just wondered if you had any reflections on that around, was the effort in applying contribution analysis to realist evaluation worth the payoff? Do you feel you got a richer or clearer picture as a result of that contribution analysis, as opposed to just using a good mixed methods approach in a realist evaluation?
So it's a good question. I guess I'd also say, I'm not, I haven't had 10 years in realist evaluation. So it may have been that someone in my situation would have been able to see the wood for the trees when it came to using those methods. But I think for me, my foray into these methods, and again, it was fairly just on my own. I'd read some stuff. I was like, this seems great. The problems I'd encountered with that around getting lost in a million CMOCs and not knowing clearly how to tell someone who's not an evaluator what I would do next. I think that was where then I looked for something to help me, and contribution analysis helped me. So from my perspective, it was definitely worth it because it was so transparent, right? So I think when obviously it has to be iterative, you go back and forth between all of these things, but because it's so clear, it's got these 6 steps, it's very clear, but it doesn't reduce the thing you're evaluating, but it does give you a clear, consistent process for communicating to other people how you're going to do it, and for yourself about how you're going to do it. So for me, definitely, I think it's different to QCA. So I also have looked into doing QCA, but I couldn't do it with the time and money available. But I would love to. But I think what's good about contribution analysis is it's more just it's similar to realist valuation in that sense of it's a way of approaching the thing rather than a strict set of a menu of methods. So for that reason, in the same way that I loved that about realist valuation, I found that really helpful about contribution analysis too.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you.
Then to be able to go back, be a PhD student with all the time that you had, that you didn't think you had, but actually you did have. And when you're a PhD student, you don't think you've got any time, but you do. And to be able to sit with this and play and work out how it could contribute, I think would be really interesting. One of the things that I had wondered is, do you think it adds more to the rigor of the program theories that you develop? Do you feel that they are more?
Sure. Well, in the sense of, it depends how we define rigor, right? But if we define it based on, which I think as we should in complexity, which is based on triangulation a lot of the time, I think it really, really did. So, but in that sense, I think it really helped at the end point, at the end of the cycle. I think it helped us to strengthen the rigor of the program theories. I think earlier on, because of this realist matrix thing, it really helped us out there. So I think it was rigorous in the sense that it enabled us to be confident enough to hold these things lightly and not get freaked out by the fact that, you know, when someone, I mean, the amount of times I've been like, yeah, but exactly how does that link to that with a practitioner or a service? And they're like, they all interact with each other, obviously, you know. So it gave us the confidence to respect that, you know, to say, okay, that is the case. And that felt rigorous in the sense that we were effectively capturing what was as much as we could, because all of these theories are just models, right? And they're, every time you try and grasp reality, you lose something. But more so than I'd done before, by being able to hold it open while not being unconfigured because of the higher order CMOCs, that felt rigorous or more rigorous than it did before.
So just as a lead on from that, because now I've really got my nerd hat on. If you had data, perhaps you didn't have lots of data, because sometimes something can just pop up very because a specific context has triggered a specific mechanism, but it can actually be quite important, but there isn't, it hasn't happened an awful lot of times. What would you do with that kind of data? Because that can equally be important, but from the framework, you would end up with, I suppose, less evidence to be able to contribute that. Would you drop that as a line, as a potential finding?
Sure. So two things. One thing is of the classic answer, but it depends. So if it depends on what it was. So if the people, you know, we had multiple researchers doing the analysis. So if something was raised as a flag, we were all quite close with the partner. We'd see something that was like, oh, this seems important. You know, if it was a particularly negative consequence, for example. So we did do that. So there was one, someone flagged that they thought the program may have undermined the infrastructure within the local authority because it wasn't tied in to the local authority system. Only one or two, I think one external stakeholder actually said that, but we felt it was important to report, and we discussed that with the partner, right? But there were other things which did only crop up a small number of times, which just didn't make the cut, because the most important thing was it was useful and usable, which also means communicable and short enough, and we had to prioritize. So it really depended on the kind of thing. And I think the rigor came through, as well as triangulation, the process of involving LEAP in decision making.
Okay, thanks. I think I could probably have. I think I'd like to be a fly on the wall. I think my dog might be eating a bit of paper. I think I'd like to be a fly on the wall to watch it. I'd like to see how it plays out. Just from an you know, I suppose like a little workshop point of view, isn't it? More than that. Does anyone else have any more questions for Finlay? I mean, we do have another 20 minutes left of the session. I'm happy to take more questions for Finlay, and if not, I'm happy to stick around for the next 20 minutes if anyone else wants to stick around, answer any challenging questions that people might have. Marie, nice to see you.
Hi, nice to see you again. Finlay, great session. Thanks. And I'm one of those people who's a practice person, sort of guest starring in academia through a PhD using reality realist. I was interested to hear that you said you were sort of revisiting programs or work that you've been involved with and before. And for you, how much was your having had that exposure experience and sort of having skin in the game, as it were, who then could sort of empathize, help interpret what was going on? Because often in the kind of puritanical research, such bias, these things are seen as a bias. Whereas for me, I see it much more, you know, you can be, declare your interests, etc. Sure. But it just gives you an insight. And I was just wondering to what degree that was important, especially where you have external evaluators coming in, like you say, who know the area, but others who don't. And objectivity is often seen as a good thing, whereas actually, when it comes to interpreting this sort of data, it's actually not, in my experience. But interesting on your reflections there.
Yeah, it's a good question. So it's a fair question. I was mindful of it, obviously, because I love Lambeth, right? So I was conscious of that. I think it comes back to the previous question answer though, in that it was by involving multiple people. That's another way you hedge that risk, right? So I wasn't the only person. While I was leading on the evaluation and the structure and how we were approaching it. Our interpretation of the evidence, even within our evaluation team, we had a big team. We had this stellar group of community researchers who were parents in the local area who didn't mind saying when they thought we were getting it completely wrong. They did a lot of the data collection as well. So that community research element was a really important part of dealing with that risk. But I think, if someone would suggest that we had bias because we were too involved, I suggest that is a risk, but the bigger risk is to not develop a trusting relationship with the delivery organization and therefore not invite them to interrogate your biases throughout the process, right? That was more important, but you win some, you lose some, I guess.
No, thank you. That's great. Thank you.
Thanks, Marie. We've got one question from Chad, and if anyone else wants to ask any more, we still have time for a few more. Chad, I'm sure I saw you come on earlier. Are you still here?
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
It's not very well articulated in the chat, but
try again.
One of the things I'm kind of really interested in terms of own research, but in terms of my work is how do we make like ways of doing evaluation that kind of promote that kind of participation of different stakeholders in kind of understanding, undertaking and using evaluation. And I guess in terms of the way that you've described the application of realist evaluation and contribution analysis in the kind of context in which it's happened, was there anything like on reflection of that about particular people that you kind of worked with that kind of supported that championing or advocacy for evaluation, or at certain moments it kind of altered maybe their potential attitudes, behaviours, assumptions towards evaluation, and then that kind of engagement towards the findings and kind of considering their potential use in terms of how they might use them to kind of influence decision making or kind of practical actions as a result?
It's a good question. So they were an interesting partner, Leap, because they had a research function, but the researchers were very close to the delivery. And when I got there, they were in year 8, right? Year 8 or 9. So they were very familiar with the complexity that they were faced with when they wanted to do a whole program evaluation. They knew it wouldn't fit a standard or traditional evaluation design. They just didn't know how to go about it. So there was a real appetite there already to do something that was more complexity sensitive. And they collected loads of data. They had a fantastic shared measurement system. They had all this stuff, but they didn't really know how to make it all sing and put it together. So I didn't do anything around the appetite for that, but they were really keen to get involved and interrogate the method completely when we gave them a way of doing that. So, and for them, this was the evaluation of their program. They knew collective impact is difficult, it's messy. They were looking for something that would reflect that anyway. So there wasn't much of a case to be made. And I'd say that was probably true for a lot of different, for practitioners in these systems. They know the complexities there, and they know that evaluation is important for helping to, to creating their legacy, especially when they're time bound like Leap was. So they think it's important. They know roughly how they want to go about it, but they don't really have the exact detail. So it was a bit of an open call.
Hello, sorry, I just had a bit of a coughing fit. Sorry, Chad, does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's helpful, thank you.
Does anyone have anything else for Finlay? Anyone else want to pick his brains before he heads off back to evaluation land? Nope. Well, if not, then you can have 14 minutes of your life back. Go and have a latte, write an email, do whatever it is you want to do. I will hang around for the next 40 minutes. So if there are any new people on the chat who want some help with any basic realist principles, or anyone wants to talk to me about ideas for future seminars or training needs, then please stay on. Otherwise, hopefully we'll see you all next month for Emma Williams as we launch our series of seminars. We've got a lot from the book this year, so hopefully we'll see you then. But thank you very much for coming, and thanks so much, Finley. And again, one round of applause. Thank you. Thank you. So you're not very good with turning on your noise.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.